Thanks for coming, everybody. So like Maggie said, today's topic is how to migrate your site from an SEO perspective. A little bit about me, head of SEO here at 2 Octobers. I've been here just about 2 years. I'm one of those strange SEOs that really loves both technical SEO and local SEO. SEOs tend to specialize in kind of one area, and I like the overlap between the two. My SEO migration experience, I helped Time Magazine do a migration from HTTP to HTTPS last year. And I've helped a variety of sites in multiple types of migrations. So I feel like I'm pretty well versed for this topic. And my favorite SEO moment, it was getting to record an episode of Moz Whiteboard Friday from the Moz office last May. So, and then a little bit about 2 Octobers. Maggie gave you a little bit of intro into our training and coaching philosophy, just overall about the organization. Our purpose is to help good people and organizations make better and more informed decisions. And one way we do that is as with our newly achieved certification as a certified B Corp business, which means that we're committed to a balance of profit and purpose. So that really helps us focus in on the types of businesses that we get to work with. And if you want to learn more about that, we've got some cool videos on our website about becoming a B Corp business. So diving into the 4 areas that we'll talk about today in regards to website migrations, we'll talk about strategy, planning, execution, and monitoring, and all the different things that go into each of those. And like Maggie said, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to drop them into the chat box. I should see an option for that down on the bottom of your screen. If it's relevant to the area that we're talking about at the moment, I'll try to pay attention to chat, and Maggie will definitely pay attention to, and we'll try to answer it then. If not, we'll definitely answer any questions that pop up in the chat during the office hours afterwards. All right, just kind of a thing, we've got a small group. If people want to drop into the chat right now, if you're just here to kind of learn about migrations, or if you're actually getting ready or in process of a website migration, if you want to drop kind of that info into the chat, just so I have a sense of kind of where everybody's at right now, and then we'll kick it off. And if you're just here to learn, that's totally fine too. Yes, there will be a recording available. We'll have that up, I think usually within a week or so we have the recordings up. Is that right, Maggie?
Yeah, probably early next week.
Yep, be up on our YouTube. Awesome. Sounds like a little bit of a mix of where everybody's at. So, all right, we'll get into it. Get my mouse. So defining what a website migration is. It's the process of describing the process of making significant changes to your website's domain, platform, structure, content, or design. Website migrations are kind of, when I think about website migrations, I think about when you build a house, you wouldn't go through the process of building a house without an architect or a blueprint. And similarly, in my experience, it's not recommended to go through a website migration in most forms without a plan and without SEO support. So today we'll talk about the best practices and things that you should consider from an SEO perspective for a variety of types of website migrations. And pretty much everything we talk about could be applied to any type of website migration. There's obviously some exceptions, but pretty broad. A few horror stories. Not every migration goes smoothly. There's always something that pops up, but I pulled some of my fellow SEO people on Twitter and got a couple SEO migration horror stories. One person said that they Had a client that went for 6 months with a disallow in their robots.txt file, which basically tells search engine crawlers not to crawl the content on their website. And the client had no idea why their traffic had tanked. And obviously, if search engine crawlers couldn't crawl their content, then that would definitely negatively impact website traffic. Someone else at an agency had a site reach out because their traffic had dropped significantly after they launched a new site, and it was discovered that they didn't move any of their previous website content over to the new site. They went from 5,000 pages to 25, but it didn't matter to them at the moment because all of their site was visually appealing to customers, and it took about 3 months to get all of that back into order. So just a few things that you definitely want to avoid, and we'll talk about some of those as well in further detail. So the goal of a website migration, especially from an SEO perspective, is to mitigate traffic and conversion losses. You're going to be going through possibly a pretty big undertaking, and working to mitigate as much of those traffic and conversion losses as possible is the ultimate goal. Obviously, there's other goals that come with a migration, but from a KPI standpoint, those are the big goals. So we'll dive into strategy first, talking about why you're migrating, understanding the impact of a migration, goal setting, and then some other key points of strategy behind a website migration. So to kick things off, when you're deciding if you're going to migrate your website, you should really ask yourself a few questions when you're thinking about why to migrate. So is something on the website broken? Maybe you run an e-commerce site and there's just some features with the checkout process or the add to cart process or something that you're just not loving, and there's just things that are broken. And by migrating, you could switch to a different CMS and that would fix those issues. Maybe there's something missing from your site. Maybe there are features that your website has grown and your current CMS just doesn't have certain features that you wish it had. So by migrating, you would be able to add those features. Or maybe there's a better option for your site. Maybe you're on something that's not super robust like Squarespace, and you're getting ready to set up an e-commerce store, and you know that's switching to something like Shopify or even BigCommerce, if you're going to be having a lot of inventory, would be a lot better option. So really stopping before you even decide what type of migration to figure out exactly why you're thinking about migrating. Thinking about migrations and as far as the impact and as far as revenue goes. So looking at a scenario which would be redirect mapping. If you're migrating a website and you have a lot of URLs that are going to be changing, sometimes people could say, well, why does that need to be done before the website launches? Why can't we take care of that later on? And this kind of formula could be, or scenario could be applied to a lot of different types of projects, but really trying to drive home what the impact of involving SEO could be and why you should think about involving SEO, especially from the start. So for example, say you decide to do redirect mapping before your website launches. It would take approximately, in this case, 3 hours of an SEO's time at $125 an hour, an hour of development time at $100 an hour. So your total investment would cost $475. If you add in monthly sessions and revenue per session, you can get that data as well, that total monthly site revenue is $150,000. Say you decide to not do your redirects until after the site launches. Some impacts of that could be it takes Google longer to find new URLs on your website. There could be broken URLs because you didn't do redirect mapping. So maybe some high traffic pages that used to exist don't exist anymore, or they're harder to find. It's going to take could take an SEO up to 15 hours to go and find all of those issues, diagnose what that problem is, fix or find and create a redirect map that correctly maps all of those old URLs to the new URLs or URLs that don't exist anymore. It's going to take a developer a lot of time to go in and put in those redirects and redo that redirect map instead of an hour before the site launch. That's going to could take up to 15 hours because they have to do a lot more cleanup work. So your total investment in something as simple as a redirect map goes from $475 if it's done before a site launches to $3,375 after a site launches. And then we look at the number of monthly sessions that dropped because Google was having trouble finding URLs. They were getting lost. URLs didn't exist anymore. And that decreases the total monthly site revenue on top of what you have to spend to clean up the issue. Just kind of gives you a picture of why involving SEO before you start to think about a migration or at the start of a migration can be really helpful. So to kind of put that in a slightly different picture, the additional SEO and dev fees would be $2,900. You lost $222,000, and so the total financial impact of not having SEO involved at the start of a migration was $25,000 to the business. Obviously, this could scale up or down depending on the size of the business, but just kind of something to think about, and the impact of having those resources when you're thinking about something like a website migration. Again, just kind of, trying to drive home the impact of a website migration and not having planning. So when we see a website migration fail, it's oftentimes because there was a lack of awareness and the risks involved in a website migration. And there's oftentimes poor planning, maybe not a checklist is followed, maybe everybody that should be involved in the process wasn't involved in the process. Like I said, not a checklist being used, and then a lack of knowledge by the people heading up the migration. So all of those things can lead to those revenue losses and ultimately making a migration a lot riskier than it often has to be. I've definitely been involved in a lot of really smooth migrations because we followed a lot of the steps that we're going to talk about today. If you understand the impact of the things that we just talked about, we can limit organic traffic loss, we can have minimal conversion loss, and a minimal decrease in rankings with a website migration. So when you're getting ready to migrate, it's definitely a good idea to sit down and set goals for the migration. So you've identified why you want to migrate. So what do you want to improve? It's important to think about that. Maybe you want to improve user experience. So increasing something like click-through rate to product pages, or increasing sales. It's also important to be realistic about the goals that you're setting. Don't expect that things are going to change overnight. And also you need to be prepared to see a slight decrease in traffic and conversions. Obviously while the goal is to mitigate the loss of traffic and conversions, it is definitely common and acceptable to see a little bit of loss in things like traffic and conversions. Sometimes we'll see a loss in traffic and we'll see an increase in conversions because through whatever migration we've done, we've improved things that we're getting more qualified traffic. So just reminding yourself to take a deep breath and be realistic about your expectations for the process. And then also think about, is there a better option for your site? Sometimes migrating isn't the best option. Maybe just redoing your content and updating your content on the site would help you achieve some of the goals that you have. So this is where setting goals is a really good thing, and helping you decide what type of migration is best, if any, for your site. So now that we've defined what a migration is and you know the impact of migration, you have to decide what type of migration is best for your business. So there's a few different types of website migrations. A simple domain name change migration where you're just updating the domain name on your website. So maybe you have a .com and you decide you want to change your domain name to .digital or .tech or .org. This is a pretty low complexity type of migration. It just typically involves a lot of redirect mapping and updating of URLs. There's not a lot of technical things involved aside from that. Another type of migration, again, that's low complexity, is updating from HTTP to HTTPS. Most of that's done at the domain level, and then redirect setup again. So that's pretty low in complexity. We start to get a little more complex when we look at things like a website redesign, which we're actually tackling right now at 2 October. So we've been kind of going through some of these steps as well internally. But anytime you have a website rebrand or redesign, typically you're going to be changing things like navigation and maybe URL structure, maybe adding content, taking away content, and that's where things start to get a little more complex. Merging multiple domain names into one. So maybe your company decides to acquire some other businesses, and you're merging those sites into your site, or your business has a couple of different sites for one reason or another, and you're merging all those into one. Similar to a rebrand or a redesign, this can be a little more complicated because there's a lot more moving parts. And then the last type of common migration would be a CMS migration. So for an e-commerce store, maybe they're in WordPress and they've decided that they've kind of outgrown WordPress and they want to go to something a little more e-commerce focused like Shopify. This can definitely be a lot more complicated because you're changing a lot of things like structurally as far as like template and that sort of thing. This doesn't have to be super complicated. If it kind of depends on the CMS that you're on and the CMS that you're moving to. A lot of CMSs, if you're moving into WordPress will have migrators that will kind of make that process a lot more seamless, especially if you're using like a dedicated WordPress host. But just something to think about when you're deciding what type of migration you want to go through, that there can definitely be varying degrees of complexity. When you're deciding to migrate, it's definitely important to assess the resources that you have at your disposal. So maybe you're a marketing team of one, or maybe you have a whole team to rely on. Either way, you need to evaluate the resources that you have or don't have. It's also a great time to consider if you're going to bring in extra help, like an external SEO, to help you execute the migration. Some things to ask yourself when you're assessing your resources are, who are the core members of your team that need to be involved in the migration if you're not just a team of one? Are there any other stakeholders that need to be involved, like product owners, people that own different areas of your existing website? Also, are there any concurrent company launches or product releases going on? Things to think about when you start to decide what kind of resources you have when you're starting to plan a migration. Timing is definitely something to take into consideration when you're starting to strategize for your website migration. If you're an e-commerce website, it's probably best that you don't choose Q4 to launch your new website, or maybe even Q3. Definitely, things typically take longer than we think they will when it comes to migrations, especially if they're more complex and they have a lot of moving parts and a lot of people involved. So definitely consider things like seasonality. Remember that things take longer, and then also consider the stakeholders and their schedules. If you have someone on your team who is going to be going on vacation right when you're deciding to migrate, or has another big life event coming up, make sure you take those things into consideration when you're deciding to migrate. And then when you're thinking about bringing in SEO into a migration, SEOs can definitely help with the mitigation of things like traffic loss and conversion. Involving SEO can help when you get to the staging site section of, or part of the process, in auditing the staging site, helping to QA all of your redirects. And SEOs just can generally help provide best practices and support when it comes to a website migration. And it can also help take kind of, if you're running a marketing team and you're trying to decide if you should bring in an SEO resource to help on with the migration process, it can help take some of that load off of your plate, especially if you haven't gone through something like a big migration before. So we've talked about strategy and how to kind of think strategically about a website migration. Now we'll talk about planning and how to plan out and what things you should be taking into consideration when planning for your migration. Using something like a migration project plan or a timeline that's really detailed can help keep you organized, and also make sure that everyone who's involved in the process knows who's responsible for what and knows what needs to happen when. So having a plan that everybody has access to is a really great way to not only keep things organized, but also keep everybody accountable for their specific parts of a migration. One of the most important things to do is to benchmark and collect data. So collecting as much data as possible as you can during this phase, the better you'll feel later on. Having benchmark data allows you to have a historical record of how the website was performing before the migration. You can even take it one step further and create a dashboard in a tool like Google Data Studio to keep everything organized and be able to reference all of your benchmark data. When it comes to benchmarking data, you definitely want to dive into your analytics, whether that's Google Analytics or any other type of analytics software that you're using. Export a list of all pages that have received at least one visitor in the last 12 months. Doing this ensures that all of the pages that have been driving traffic get accounted for when URLs are being mapped in the redirect mapping phase. Typically, average monthly organic traffic and conversions per page are great things to benchmark. Make sure to dive into Google Search Console if you have that set up, and export a list of all URLs that are currently ranking in Google, so that you have that list to compare when you are monitoring your migration later on. Getting a full website crawl of your existing site, so using a tool like Screaming Frog or Sitebulb or another crawling tool to crawl and export a full crawl of all of the URLs on the website will help in that URL mapping plan. It's also important to make sure that you include subdomains if those exist on your current site. And then also making sure to, when you do this crawl, to look for and maybe do a small audit of existing issues. So broken redirects, site speed issues, anything that could possibly be fixed during the migration process, so it's not carried over to a new site, can definitely save you a lot of time and trouble later on. Another important thing to have is keyword position. So using a tool like SEMrush or Ahrefs, or even the query position report in Google Search Console to get keyword position, so that you can compare that in the monitoring phase and see hopefully where things are improving after the migration happens, or if you see things not improving, using that as a red flag to dive in and see what needs to be fixed. Another important part of the migration process is content planning. So a website migration is a great time to take stock of the current content on your website and decide if there's content that should be removed or updated. It's also a great time to decide what new content you should be creating for your website. You don't obviously have to create all of that content right away as you're migrating, but it's good information to have as you move into life with a new website and think about content that you want to be adding. So once you've done all of the planning and the data collecting and you have all of your data benchmarked, it's time to start actually executing the migration process, and having, again, that checklist that walks you through all of the steps that you should be doing during this phase can definitely help keep you on track and keep you organized. For most types of migration, having a staging environment is definitely needed. If you're doing anything that's more complex than just a domain name change or an HTTP to HTTPS migration, you definitely want to have a staging environment. You want to be able to test everything before the new site goes live. One thing that you might want to make note of is that it's really important with staging environments is to make sure that you prevent search engines from crawling and indexing your staging site. This can lead to duplicate content issues later on and just be kind of a pain to have to deal with. So if you have one takeaway, is to make sure that you don't have your staging site indexed. The first step with the staging sites, or one important step with the staging site, is to ensure that you actually audit it. So not only having a staging site, but this is where having an SEO involved in your migration can be really helpful, because we can go through and actually audit your staging site, make sure that there's no issues that would impede Google from crawling it, any user experience issues, anything like site speed, making sure that internal links are all pointing to the right place, all of those types of things, making sure all of those things are mitigated before you actually go live. We can take care of those on the staging site, it's best. A lot of common errors we see in staging site, missing content. So maybe when you're moving content over to the staging site from the old site, some of it didn't get moved over. Similarly, pages that used to exist not existing anymore. If you're keeping the same pages, check that the number of URLs on the staging site matches the number of URLs on the old one. Seems simple, but sometimes people forget to do that. If you're changing the domain or the URL structure, make sure all internal links are updated and going to the new URL, that you're not just relying on 301 redirects, but that you're actually updating those URLs to the new version of the URL. Same thing for canonical URLs, that those rel canonical tags have been updated to the new URL. Oftentimes we'll see a migration happen, and even if it's a self-referencing canonical tag, it'll list the old site and not the new site, and that can definitely send mixed signals to Google. And then ensuring that there's a custom 404 page. So having a 404 page that says, hey, you landed on a page that doesn't exist. Here's how you get back to the rest of our website, is something super simple, but definitely something that people tend to forget about. Anything that you know you want to have live on the real site, make sure that that's on your staging site. When it comes to URL mapping, so if you have URLs on your website, that will be changing. You need to create a map of where all those URLs will redirect to. It's important not to just redirect everything to one page, not to use your home page as kind of the dumping ground for all of your URLs, but actually sit down and decide logically what URLs should be redirected to a URL that makes the most sense. So for example, if our website was websiteblog.com and our new URL is going to be website/blog.com. We were websiteaboutus.com, websiteabout.com. Making sure that every URL that's going to be changing has its counterpart mapped out so that those redirects can be put in place and everything has a complete one-to-one redirect. Oops, skipped a page. Couple pages. There we go. And another important thing is to remember that old URL, and I just touched on this a minute ago, but old URLs that have been 301 redirected get redirected to a new URL. So maybe 2 years ago, you went through and updated some blog URLs and you have a bunch of 301 redirects in place. It's important that you don't rely on kind of that redirect chain to just kind of count when you're migrating things. You want all of those old URLs that have been 301 redirected to get redirected to that last URL in the new site map or in the new website. So making sure that that's part of your redirect map as well, that you're not just paying attention to existing URLs, but any old URLs that might have 301 redirects on them. Another important part of the pre-migration process is testing. So testing for things like user experience. It's not just all about obviously the technical things and things like redirects, but you want to make sure everything on your site works. So if you're an e-commerce site, making sure you run through your checkout process, making sure you have somebody run through all of the contact forms on your website and make sure all of those work. Just testing all of those things to make sure everything is sound and functional before it gets moved over to a new site. When it comes to the actual day of migration, it's also important to make sure that you're following a checklist, because there's a lot of little things that can definitely fall under the wayside that you might not think about. So having a checklist to reference can be really helpful, and also ensuring that everybody who's involved knows what their role is on the day of migration. Some common things that people tend to forget about, making sure that your Google Analytics is set up, that you're referencing your Google Search Console to make sure that you've added your new sitemap. You're going through and checking all of those redirects, just kind of making sure you run through this checklist the day of the migration to make sure everything is working like it should. So you've gone through strategy, we've gone through planning, we've gone through executing, and now that you've migrated, we need to monitor things. You've migrated, but you're not done. There's definitely still work to be done, even after you've gone through the actual migration process. When it comes to monitoring, we want to be monitoring for to ensure that things are working properly and that traffic and conversions are hopefully holding steady or at least not dropping too much. Closely monitoring ensures that if there is a drop, you catch it right away. And for monitoring, I would suggest keeping this monitoring checklist handy for at least 1 to 2 months after the migration, and maybe longer depending on the scale of the migration and how big the site was. When it comes to monitoring, it's not just monitoring your actual website. You definitely want to monitor Google Analytics as well. So this is also where engaging with an SEO for part of your migration can be really helpful because they can help you double check things in Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager, because we know that your data is really important to you and it helps inform a lot of your business decisions. So if you somehow something in your Google Analytics gets messed up during the migration, especially if you have a complicated setup, it's definitely important that somebody's on top of that to make sure everything is accounted for. Paying attention to what URLs Google is indexing is really important post-migration. You want to make sure that they're finding redirects and that they're finding any new content that existed or that was added. So finding those redirects from the old content and then finding the new content. So monitoring what Google is indexing in Google Search Console should definitely be top of mind when you're monitoring your migration. Comparing your benchmark data to your new data is another way to monitor the success of your migration. So revisiting the goals that you set at the start of the migration process and using those to help you determine the success of your migration along with your benchmark data is definitely advised. Some resources for the migration process. There's a link to, that's a link to the migration checklist. I shared bits of that throughout the presentation, little snippets of the migration checklist. The full migration checklist is there. You can make a copy of it, adjust it to your needs. I mentioned Screaming Frog for crawling your existing site. You can also use Screaming Frog for crawling your staging site. It's a great way to get a list of all of the new URLs. Using Google Data Studio, I mentioned that for benchmarking, it's a great way to have kind of a live dashboard into all of your benchmarking data. And then obviously Google Analytics and Google Search Console. Sorry. So what's next? How can 2 Octobers help you? Maybe you're thinking about a migration and something you're not quite ready to tackle on your own. We're definitely here and can help support your team from pre-migration all the way through the migration process. Or maybe you have another SEO service, another SEO project you want help with, content marketing, SEM, marketing analytics, all things that 2 Octobers can help you with. So that's the presentation on SEO migrations. We'll dive into office hours in a second, and just kind of a snapshot of some of the workshops that we have coming up next. If you signed up, you probably were prompted to maybe sign up for some other ones, but feel free to check out our full list of workshops on the website, and we'll be adding to it for 2021 in the next few months as well. Awesome. If you are muted, you're welcome to unmute yourself for the office hours portion.